Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. A new feature that I recently figured out is that if you host an online shop on your Squarespace website and you connect your Square Reader, you can actually keep track of your inventory. So for those of you who don't know, if you do in-person conventions and artist alleys, a Square Reader allows you to accept card payments, which is such a game changer these days since people often don't have as much cash on them. But the annoying thing about selling merch online and in person is keeping track of the inventory in two different places. So if you connect your Square account with Squarespace, it will actually keep track of the inventory when someone purchases something online, and then it'll adjust for you on the website. So streamlined, makes your life so much easier. So if you're interested in launching your own website, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Hello friends, I hope that you've been well and welcome to a new video. Today we are going to be working on a mixed media illustration. Here you see I have a bunch of watercolor paints that were left over from previous paintings, and I've just added more water to them to reactivate them. These are all the watercolor tubes that I've pulled out that I predicted I was going to use. Spoiler alert, I didn't end up using the yellow and one of the greens, I believe, but all the other colors I did use, as well as whatever was in these palettes. So to start, I'm using a wet on wet technique, cover the areas that I want to paint with just clean water, and then I'm adding really light washes of watercolor on top. And as you might have guessed from the topic of today's video, I am sort of experimenting more with hot press watercolor paper. So for those of you who don't know, there is two major types of watercolor papers, cold press being the type of paper that I typically use, which has that texture on the surface, and then hot press paper being very smooth. There's also rough, which as you may have guessed is even more textured than cold press paper, but we're not really going to discuss that type of paper since that's not something that I use. So up until this point, I've always preferred cold press watercolor paper. The only experience that I have had with hot press paper was a more student grade or like cheaper hot press paper, and I never really enjoyed using it that much, especially when it came to using it just for watercolors. I found that I think whenever I did use the hot press paper, I always would just end up using either gouache or color pencils on top because it just was very difficult for me to use with just watercolors. And so I just sort of got into my head that hot press paper just was not for me. But when I used to work at an art supply store, and when I finally decided to quit, I was like, you know what? I need to buy all the art supplies right now before I leave because I get a major discount and I'll never be able to see these types of prices again. And something that is very expensive is watercolor paper. And so I actually bought some artist grade 100% cotton hot press watercolor paper as well as cold press, and thought maybe I will finally come around to seeing the light and see if I actually do like hot press paper. And my impression of it was just because I wasn't using like a really high quality of it, like high quality version of it. So when I set out for today's illustration, which I say today, but I've been working on this for like a week, I knew that for the month of October, I wanted to do something that was somewhat spooky because it is my favorite time of the year. And you probably know that I have a Patreon page where I pick a theme every single month, and then so I make artwork for the print and sticker, and not always picking a theme based off of the actual month, but October is definitely the exception. I always pick something spooky related, and I technically have painted Medusa / a Gorgon before, but I really never get tired of it. And this was a concept that I have had in my mind for a while, but have never executed, which is actually painting Medusa with one of her quote unquote victims, I suppose, you know, someone that she actually has turned into stone. And so I thought that with this concept, painting a stone figure or statue would need that like kind of gritty texture, and colored pencil I thought would be perfect for that. But I wasn't really in the mood to be creating an entire illustration out of colored pencils, so I figured why not do a mixed media where I could do watercolors and colored pencils together. And the thing about colored pencils is that, yes, there is texture. There's always going to be texture when you use it. But when you use colored pencils on cold press watercolor paper, it's like extra textured, which is not exactly what I wanted to go for, especially when it came to Medusa, who I wanted to look a lot smoother. So I figured this was the perfect time to finally try out this hot press watercolor paper. And I will have all the links in the description for all the materials, but I'm using the Artistico Fabriano 100% watercolor block. I've obviously taken it out of the block and taped it down to the Masonite board so that I could transfer the sketch with my light pad. But anyway, as you can see, I'm well away into the painting here, and something that I immediately noticed, especially in these early stages of the painting, is that the watercolors kind of absorb into the paper very quickly. Whereas I find that with cold press watercolor paper, especially if you're using like a wet on wet technique where you cover the surface with clean water first and you paint and you add the paint on top, you get really like soft blooms and gradients, and the colors like very kind of seamlessly bleed into one another, which is a technique that I use a lot, and it definitely can be achieved on hot press paper, but it doesn't move nearly as much. And so I find that the gradients are not nearly as smooth as they are when I use cold press paper. And so I find that you can see brushstrokes a lot easier, and you can kind of like see where I've tried to like move the paint around, and it's just like not as forgiving in that regard using hot press paper. But I will say a huge benefit of the smooth hot press paper was transferring that sketch initially, because it's so smooth, you're getting much like better precision with your pencil, whereas with cold press paper there's texture, so sometimes your sketch lines are not nearly as smooth. They can be a little bumpy or a little bit inaccurate. So hot press paper, definitely a huge bonus for when I'm working on something that has a lot of little details. And if you've been with my channel for a while, you'll know that I've done something similar to this before. In the past, I made a video, I think actually it was during the month of October. I did this illustration of Coraline, and in that video I talked about doing a process where I used acrylic gouache with colored pencils on top. And the nice thing about using acrylic gouache is that because it's a much thicker medium, it kind of created a smoother surface on top of a cold pressed watercolor paper, and then using the colored pencils on top, it's like smooth but has a little bit of grit, which is a really nice combination. But the nice thing about using watercolors is that I really love achieving these like kind of atmospheric layers with them that you can't get with acrylic gouache or gouache. There's just like this luminosity that you get when you have the paper sort of seeping or peeking through the layers of color, as opposed to just a really opaque medium. It's hard to explain, but I do find that there is a difference. And yeah, I've just been like in a much more watercolor mood lately, so that's why I decided to go this route. And yeah, even though I talked about how achieving gradients was a little bit more difficult with this hot press paper, it's definitely still achievable, and I really had a lot of fun playing around with the varying hues of warm greens and blues and teals in our Medusa character here, and then with the concrete or stone statue, I didn't want it to be gray. That just feels so boring to me. So I decided to keep him in a more kind of like blue, a little bit purple leaning kind of color palette, and the blue tying the two of them together. But I find that purple and blue and green is just like a really interesting color combination that I never used to go for, but I'm really into nowadays. And for the background, I have been really into just doing really dark backgrounds with really colorful or pastel subjects. For this case, I originally wanted it to be a kind of marbling or like very watercolor effect with variations of black and this Daniel Smith watercolor called Moonstone. Moonstone, it's so beautiful. It's like this purple gray, but then it granulates with little flecks of like blues and magentas. But again, like how I was talking about with hot press paper, it just doesn't flow across the surface the same way as cold press watercolor paper does. So I found that this paper really just did no justice to the Moonglow paint. And even when I tried to do a second layer for that background with the Moonglow, you could still see all of the brush strokes, and it just didn't bloom and bleed in the way that I had hoped it would. So later on, I ended up just covering it completely with black gouache and just went with like a super dark, just like a matte black background. And I find that actually ends up looking a lot better anyways. It really makes the subjects really pop. And yeah, so that's something to note as well. If you're someone who really loves granulating watercolor paper, I really don't think hot press paper does it justice. So if you're someone who is on the fence about it, that's just something to note. But yeah, here I'm going in with more blue teal tones to really kind of get all these colors to meld together and create a little bit more shadows and depth on the snakes here. And now that I'm watching this process, I'm like so deeply associating this painting with the Six of Crows, because that's what I spent a lot of the painting listening to. I've been listening to, or actually finally finished the Six of Crows audiobook while I was working on this painting. Oh, and this part right here is probably one of my favorite parts of this entire painting process, was when I added in this like wash of blue kind of around the like both characters, but especially this part here. I think that it was kind of nerve-wracking to do initially, but I think it really helped create like this vignette effect and allows the viewer to focus more on the faces, which have like more contrast and obviously is the focal point of the illustration. Again, it's all about that like atmospheric vibe that you can get with watercolors, and I'm trying to, take advantage of that in this medium. And on that note, so like I was mentioning at the beginning of the video, I had only experienced hot press watercolor paper with a kind of student grade brand or version. The previous ones that I've used was by Fluid, and this is 100% cotton, so it can definitely handle a lot of layers, a lot of water. I did use it, I think, a little bit more carefully than I normally do with cold press watercolor paper, because there's just something about the super smooth surface that makes me think that it's just a little bit more delicate than something with texture. But yeah, I was impressed with how many layers and how much water I was able to use. And so it's been a while since I used the student grade version, so I can't have like a definitive comparison, but I do think that much like any watercolor paper, a artist grade 100% cotton version is just going to be able to perform better if you're going to be painting with a lot of layers and a lot of paint. So yeah, I think I will continue to use the hot press paper only if I intend to use colored pencils with whatever painting medium. I do think that overall at this point in time, I still prefer a cold press if I'm going to be, picking a favorite. And I also want to quickly mention that these adorable pink paintbrushes that you see me using throughout this entire video is going to be my custom paintbrush set, which I've been talking about for a little while. I am super happy with them. I love the way that they look. They perform great. I've now used them with watercolors, regular gouache, acrylic gouache, and acrylic inks and regular inks. So they're extremely versatile and they look adorable. And yeah, they're going to be launching in probably mid-November. I don't have an exact date just yet, but if you head to the description, I'll have a link where it will take you to the landing page. And so you can hit the notification button and you'll get an email for as soon as they drop, because they will be on sale, I think, for the first week. So now I'm finally going in with some colored pencils, and yeah, I really wanted to create more texture on our stone statue here because he was looking a little bit too smooth, and I also found that the way that I had rendered him and the coloring, it sort of started to remind me of like the Silver Surfer or something, or like an X-Men character where like his body is made of metal or something much more like metallic and shiny, which is a material that I love painting, but I have to try and break that habit for this case. I think that adding the little cracks on the surface of him helped kind of bring it home, but looking back at it, I think that I could have pushed the texture on him even further, maybe add some more speckles or flecks or something to make it look more stone-like, but it's fine. I wanted to make sure that Medusa was the character that had more investment on my part. I wanted her to be the star, obviously, so I spent, I think, a little bit more time rendering her out, and here I'm finally adding in the texture of the snake skin, which I was torn whether or not I would do dark, like a darker tone for the scales, or a lighter tone, and in the end I actually ended up going with both. So I use a combination of colored pencils as well as paint to add in little specks to create the scales on kind of the mid-tone colors, and then like the mid to light tone colors, and then in the areas of shadow or the areas where it's a little bit deeper or darker, I was actually able to use this like really bright chartreuse color in with the colored pencils and actually make lighter tone scales, which I think was a really cool addition just to break up just to make it feel a little bit more interesting. And then I ended up going with another wash of this sap green and then leaving just little slivers of areas to create the highlights on some of the snakes, which again I think ended up being the better choice because they were looking a little light for a while. And the beauty of this is that I can very easily go over these areas with the watercolors, even though some of it has the colored pencils. If anything, it actually, I think, helps sort of like smooth out and like help the colored pencils blend together. And yeah, I also decided to go and use the colored pencils for some of the line art areas as well, which is also something that I typically wouldn't think of to do in this scenario. But using this like bright ultramarine blue for some of the line art was like such a treat for me. It's such a gorgeous color, and I think helps just like break up the monotony of using one tone for all of the line art. And just again to kind of circle back to the original topic, which is hot press versus cold press. If this was a cold press watercolor paper, I probably would not have used the colored pencils for the line art, again, because I would lose that precision because of the texture of the paper, whereas this is totally smooth, so it allows me that benefit of using the colored pencils for the line art, which I really enjoyed. And for those of you who might not know, colored pencils was actually my first like real foray medium I forayed into, I should say, other than graphite pencil back in high school. And I used to almost exclusively work with colored pencils and like fine liners for a really long time. So there is something really kind of nostalgic about using colored pencils, and I think I will always really enjoy using them. So it's really nice to find other ways to use it. in combination with other mediums, because when you use just color pencils, it takes forever to build up that color. So I will say that I think when it comes to watercolor, if I'm using just watercolors, I definitely prefer cold press. But I am coming around to seeing the amazing benefits of using hot press paper if you intend to use color pencils in combination with it. Because I find that, yeah, with cold press paper and color pencils, there's just too much texture. So it's just a really, really lovely combination with watercolors and or gouache. And of course, probably will always be my favorite part of any painting is working on all the little details of the eyes. I originally didn't intend to add pink to her irises, but I felt like just the yellow wasn't standing out enough. And of course, I always go in with a white paint marker. It just, all those teeny little white highlights just add that extra little touch. And then I also decided to go in with some gold ink because I still needed to paint the kind of cuff armband accessory. And I didn't want the gold only to be on her arm because of course that's not the focal point here. So I decided to go ahead and spontaneously add gold to the irises of her eyes and then select scales on the snakes as well. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but when you kind of see it in different lighting, it looks pretty cool. And I only did like a couple of scales here and there sporadically as opposed to covering them entirely. And then here I'm going in with that gold for the armband, and you can see I actually did the scales on her arms as well. It's pretty subtle, but it's definitely there. And yeah, that pretty much concluded the process of this painting. I finally got the chance to use the masking tape that I bought from Japan because I know that hot press paper, it's just more delicate, the surface. And so I felt like I could trust this Japanese masking tape not to rip. And y'all, it is amazing. This is probably the cleanest like paint peel I've ever had, and it did not damage the paper whatsoever. This paint tape is definitely like the new holy grail for sure. And before we go, I just want to also mention that my online shop is finally open. So I will have the link in the description. I have lots of prints, stickers. I have a few originals in there. So if you are interested in supporting me and the channel, I'd love for you to check it out, but no pressure, obviously. And yeah, like I mentioned, the artwork that I worked on today is the Patreon print and sticker reward for this month. So if you are interested in this Medusa illustration, you have until October 31st to sign up to receive this in the mail. And you also get access to exclusive videos, behind the scenes, work in progress photos, and podcasts. I have lots of extra goodies over there, so I'll have the link in the description for that too. And yeah, with that, I am going to close out the video. Thank you so much for being here and supporting me. I hope you have an amazing day or evening wherever you're at, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!